Hi everyone. Over the next few minutes, we're going to look at writing up the professional development record, sometimes called the PDR, which is the second part of Unit 2, the portfolio from the Trinity Diploma in TESOL. Before we get into how to write it up, let's just quickly go over some of the basics of what you already should have done before you're actually writing up. So the first thing is you need to have taught 15 hours of classes. And the idea is that whatever you're investigating in your professional development record, you've been trying that out in these 15 hours. Obviously, for most people in the course, you're teaching full time. So teaching 15 hours isn't a big deal. But the point is you've been trying out the ideas or techniques that you're investigating in 15 hours of classes. Having said that, this assignment doesn't have to be based on all 15 hours. You can base it on a minimum of 10 hours of classes. Now remember, based on a number of hours, not a number of classes. So if your classes are 2 hours long, that might only be 5 classes. If you teach lessons that are an hour long, then that would be twice as many. You can, if you want to, base your assignment on all 15 hours of classes. But whatever you do, make sure you have some evidence of those in the appendices, the ones that you used and the ones that you decided not to use, if there's any of those. So make sure that someone has signed off on the pro forma to verify that you taught those classes. And each of those lessons needs to have a minimum of 6 students in them. Alright, so that's the basics out the way. Like the other parts of the portfolio, the marks here are split into 4 sections. There's the rationale and objectives, the reflection process, the evaluations, conclusions and implications, and also the presentation and the writing style. That final part I won't go through here. I'll go through that in the next video, the IRP. Anyway, so let's go back to the start and talk about the rationale and the objectives. In this first section, your introduction, make sure that you tell the reader about your context. Who are your learners, age, country, are they monolingual, class or not, what group size. Remember that the person reading and marking this probably won't know anything about your teaching context. So this introduction is really important for setting the context for the rest of the report. And also try and make sure you avoid any jargon that's specific to the school that you're in, and use terms that people who've never been to your school, never visited your school will still understand. In that introduction, also tell us why you want to investigate the topic. So just like the classroom observation instrument, this has to be something related to improving your own teaching. It can't be about helping other teachers. I mean, that could be a sub-aim, but the point here has to be about you getting better at your own practice. So for example, if you choose to investigate error correction, the reason has to be that you want to be better at error correction, not that, for example, you're a teacher trainer and lots of your trainees have issues with this. If you're investigating group work, it has to be that you want to get better at group work, not that you mentor some new teachers and they're bad at setting up group work. So make it about you, but tell us what sparked your interest in this topic. You've obviously chosen this topic for a reason, so make sure you say what it is. Maybe you've noticed something interesting or intriguing in a class, like maybe you found that you correct lots of errors, but students still keep making the same errors in future, and that's prompted you to be interested in error correction. Maybe you spend a lot of time doing group work with your students, but you've noticed that it's actually very difficult to hear what students are saying during group work and you want to investigate more, something like that. Make sure you also have some background reading in here, something like a literature review. Maybe also say why authors think this might be an important topic. Presumably later on in the teaching section, you might try out some specific techniques. So this is an opportunity to outline where those techniques come from. So for example, to go back to the error correction example, if you try delayed error correction in your lessons later, make sure that you mention it here. So the techniques or ideas that you use later should first get mentioned here. Make sure this is where you reference them in this introduction section. Now, some candidates I find make the mistake of talking a lot about why this topic is important, but don't actually go into any of the techniques or ideas or methods that they experiment with later. So make sure you do both. Tell us why this is an important topic, but also outline some of the techniques, ideas, etc. that you're going to use later. This professional development record is really action research. So you also, I think, should tell us a bit about what research methodology you're using. The whole idea here is that you plan, teach, reflect, and then by going through that process, improve. But how are you reflecting? Are you, for example, recording short segments of classroom interaction and analyzing these? Are you keeping a reflective journal about what worked well or didn't work in different classes? Are you collecting examples of students' written work after each lesson? Whatever it is, this section doesn't have to be long, but just tell us, what are you using to reflect here? Reflective practice should be evidence-based, so make sure you tell us here what that evidence is. Now, one final thing to include in this initial section, of course, really, really important, is your aim. Just spell it out really clearly. What is the thing that you're planning on investigating, and how do you hope that's going to help you improve? So, for example, if you're looking at group work, you might say, I plan to investigate the factors which affect if students use their first or second language during group work, and develop some techniques and practices to maximize the amount of English students use in group work. Or for example, if you were looking at listening for connected speech, you might say that your aim for the project is to develop a range of techniques for helping your students improve their listening comprehension skills with connected speech. Whatever it is, make sure you outline it really clearly and give it its own heading. Alright, I think that's most of the stuff that needs to go in the introduction. Let's talk about the next big chunk here, the reflective process. This is worth 25% of the marks, and the marks here are for the quality and relevance of reflection on the developmental process. So again, some basic information you need to include here. Tell us who the learners are that you're teaching. Now, I know I mentioned this for the introduction, but in the introduction, you're probably talking about the learners that you teach in general. But here, tell us about the specific classes you taught. Remember, they're meant to be 15 hours of classes. Well, who was in those classes? What levels were they, age, etc., etc. Usually the way candidates set this out is they break it down lesson by lesson, and for each lesson, they'll outline what they attempted to do related to the aim. Now remember, when I say aim here, I'm not talking about the language aim of your class. That might be a bit too much detail to fit in here in your word count. Instead, tell us what techniques or ideas that you tried out in this particular class. So for example, if you're investigating error correction, maybe you tried peer correction in this class and you asked learners to correct each other's answers in a gap fill. Remember to keep this focused, don't waste words giving details about the class that aren't relevant to your aim. Remember, part of the marks here are for the relevance of the reflection on the developmental process. So that's maybe what you did in each lesson. For each lesson, you also want to reflect on what worked, what didn't, and what are the implications. Remember that action research is often described as a spiral process. So you really want to show in this section how what you learned in lesson 1 influenced what you did maybe in lesson 2 or lesson 3. So maybe you were investigating group work and you found that students used a lot of L1, their first language, during group work to take turns. So maybe that's led you in for lesson 2 to pre-teach some of the language for turn taking in English before you do the group work. And then you tell us how that went. So make sure that it's more than just you trying out 10 different techniques and telling us how they work. You want lessons to build on each other and for it to be clear how what you learned in the first lesson builds into the second lesson, which builds into the third lesson, etc. Having said that, you might want to try similar techniques with different classes and show how they work with different groups and different age ranges, different levels. But make sure it all stays focused on your aim. So if it is, for example, giving instructions with beginner level young learners, well, you don't want one of your classes to be an intermediate adult class because that wouldn't be very focused. When someone's reading this, it should really come through how your understanding of the topic has developed over the 10 or 15 hours of teaching here. So a lot of that was about the relevance of the reflection. Remember, the other part of the marks here is for the quality of reflection. I think this relates to evidence. So show what evidence, or tell us what the evidence is for your reflection. So, for example, if you thought that the students didn't understand my instructions in the first class, well, tell us, why did you think that? Was it that the learners did the task wrong? Or did they take a long time to get started? Or did they ask you for clarification? Or did you hear them talking to each other about it? in their first language, make sure that you show what evidence there is that you based your reflections on. Again, you need a minimum of 10 hours of classes here. That doesn't mean, if you're looking at error correction, that you need to have correct 10 hours of errors. It just means that you had 10 hours of classes in which you focused on error correction. I often find an issue that candidates have here is they want to include so much information every class. Often when you're focusing on something new, you might have a lot of extra plans or details about the classes. If you have those and you want to include them, but they're not so relevant, stick them in the appendices, and you can just say, for more information, see Appendix 1 or 2 or whatever it is. Let's move on to talk about the evaluation, conclusions, and implications. So just as I said earlier, that you want to make sure that the techniques that you try in your class, you've already mentioned them hopefully in your introduction. Well, it's the same thing here. There shouldn't be any new information or data included here. Everything that you talk about in this section, you should have already mentioned in the previous section, which was all your reflections. So let's go through evaluation, conclusions, and implications one by one. Evaluation. Say what you thought was successful in this project. How effective was it at improving your teaching? There's a real meta level to this. You're hopefully reflecting on the reflective process here. Another way to think about it is tell us what you would do differently if you were to attempt an action research project like this again. Maybe you'd have done more background reading before you started. Maybe you would have collected data differently. Maybe you would have picked more varied groups of students. I don't know. But this is your chance to talk about some of the limitations, but also say what went well also. In terms of the conclusions, tell us what you learned from the project. The big difference between the conclusions and implications, I think, are the conclusions are more discussion of what you found, whereas the implications are the actions that you would take that are based on these. I would highly recommend when you're writing this that you go back to the beginning, look at some of the techniques or ideas or methods that you first mentioned in the introduction section, and go back to them here and basically just tell us how well did they work? What did you learn about these ideas or techniques using them with your students? For example, if you were looking at giving effective instructions, maybe at the beginning you found out that several experts recommend that you ask instruction checking questions, but maybe you found that those only really worked with students who were above a certain age or above a certain level. Here's the place to mention that. When you come to write your implications, go back to your aim. Make sure you're clear about what did you want to get out of the project, and here your implications need to relate to that aim. So if the aim was finding effective ways of teaching connected speech, we'll make sure that your implications here are about effective ways of teaching connected speech. But also make sure these are based on what you wrote and said during the reflective process. So for example, if you were investigating giving clear instructions, and one of your implications is to give the handouts to students after you finish giving the instructions, we'll make sure that you mention this in that record of your classes earlier. Another common issue I find here is that candidates will sometimes make their implications read more like it's what David Noonan or Tessa Woodward says that teachers should do. You can certainly comment on what some authors have said, but really this has to be about what you've found in your reflective process. So all of your implications here, you have to be able to trace them back to the record of your teaching. And if you have some word count left over, you can also comment on what you might want to share with your colleagues or other people it might be relevant to. All right, so let's go through that again very quickly. Basics, you have to teach at least 15 hours and base this report on at least 10 of them. Your rationale and objectives. First of all, pick a focus which is relevant to your teaching. Tell us how you're going to investigate the topic. Do some background reading. And make sure that whatever you end up doing later on, you first mentioned it here. The reflective process. Tell us who you taught. Outline what you tried, what worked well, what didn't work well, and show us what was the evidence that you used for your reflections. And then finally, conclusions, implications, evaluation. Evaluate the project. How well did it go? What worked well? What didn't? Conclusions. What have you learned? And finally, implications. What will you do differently? A final point related to the word count. Remember, each of these sections has a different mark associated with it. The rationale and objectives are worth 20%, the reflective process is 25%, and the evaluation, conclusions, and implications are 40%. Remember, the remaining 15% is based on your organization, academic writing style, etc. So try and make sure that each of the sections, roughly, you have around the word count that you think is appropriate for the mark. So for example, the evaluation, conclusions, and implications, that's worth 40% of the mark. So if you've only used 20% of your words on this section, I would say you've not done enough. You need to write more. Or equally, the reflective process is worth 25%. If this is taking up half of your word count, you've probably got too much in there. I hope that was useful. Best of luck writing up your professional development record. Thanks.